Yeah, One Power. I really wanted Sherry to sing that song because to me that embodies, first of all, One Power is the first basic unity principle. You know, this idea that there is a oneness that is the essence of all of our being. But in that oneness, we have that multiplicity, if you will, of your radiant self, of your diversity, of the trees, of the flowers, of the chair, of every single thing in this room that expresses in sort of the uniqueness of the individuation of that oneness. And so I'm going to tie that song back in when we get into the topic of the type 5, which is the topic of today's lesson on the Enneagram. So welcome, everyone. I'm Reverend Nhien Doherty. I'm one of the associate ministers here at Unity Temple on the Plaza, and I am delighted to be entering into week 5 of our 10-week series on the Enneagram, which is this ancient map of consciousness, which serves us in returning to the awareness of our oneness with all that is, our oneness with the very source of our being, our oneness with our neighbor. And the Enneagram of holy ideas, which is what has been the focus of this 10-week series, is the way that we name the 9 different ways that we've fallen away from perception of that oneness. So I'm going to invite Sherry back up to lead us in song, and then we're going to launch into type 5, where we'll explore the facet of oneness that this particular orientation on the Enneagram lost awareness of and then overcompensated for. So in the 1989 film, award-winning film, Rain Man, Dustin Hoffman plays Raymond, and Tom Cruise plays Charlie, his brother. So in this movie, Tom Cruise, playing Charlie, finds out that his father has passed away. But as he does, he finds out for the first time that he actually has an older brother, and one who happens to be autistic. So he begins and develops a relationship with this brother named Raymond. Now, Raymond is this mathematical genius. But then he has this issue where his life, his daily life, is imprisoned by a kind of internal need for orderliness. And so there's an imprisonment within sort of the ritualization of his life. Sure. It's the idea that if the syrup goes before the pancakes, then it's too late, says Raymond. So that need for a certain orderliness in his life. So the two begin this relationship. And in the beginning, Tom Cruise is extremely driven, ambitious, just like a typical young man. And he's a little bit frustrated by his brother. And one might type him as a type 3 on the Enneagram, which we went over a few weeks ago. So they have this kind of relationship where, he has issues with maybe even like using his brother. That's how it starts out. But over time, he begins to develop a kind of devotion for his brother, Raymond. And in one of the most touching scenes in the movie, we see Raymond, in an atypical act, lean over and rest his head tenderly on his brother's shoulder. And in that moment, there's a feeling for all of us that Raymond was able to enter into a field of relationship and intimacy that was unusual for him. In that moment, it felt like somehow that prison that he was living in, he broke out of and sort of moved into a space that wasn't one of solitude, but one of togetherness. And in that moment, I know for me, and perhaps for many of us, when we consider that movement, there is a connection within us to that which seeks to live within the safe walls of our own structure, if you will. That which seeks to preserve itself, that which seeks to protect itself from hurt, from harm, from the ways in which interaction with the world, and especially with people, seems to destroy what little we think we have. So in that moment, what can be awakened in us is this recognition of the walls, not only that type 5s are characteristic of building, but that we all build to some degree. So today, my focus of today's sermon is not only on the walls that we build, but on the face of God that perhaps we have lost sight of, that drives the building of that wall. And how love, it may seem like love melts the walls, but for me, the perspective is slightly different. It's not like the devotion or the love of Raymond's brother melts the wall. But perhaps you can look at love a little differently. That love is itself not like a warming agent, but a perception of union or oneness that itself breaks down the illusion that there was a wall in the first place. So where the mental construct, the mind, sees concepts and divisions, perhaps the heart sees union already there. And through seeing through the apparent boundaries between one another, we actually, both in ourselves and each other, enable a coming together, an intimacy that is at the root of living itself. So the song that Sherry sang is so related to this idea that we come to life in our oneness. And so today I want to talk about how not only the 5s, but each of us are invited to a greater sense of life and living by virtue of recognizing the way the mental constructs reinforce the walls that we have between each other as belief systems reinforce walls, and the way in which the heart's beholding shifts that. So we'll begin by exploring the need for walls, not only that which is characteristic of the type 5, but that which is prevalent in us all. Then we'll move into the holy ideas that are found at the point 5. Those are the holy ideas of holy omniscience and holy transparency. And we'll learn a little bit about the meaning of those ideas and how the loss of perception of those particular faces or facets of being or reality drive a deeper sense of our desire to live within the walls of our own understanding and not move forward into an actual lived out experienced life where we live behind the walls of our ideas and our concepts of ourselves and of one another, but fail to actually move forward into a felt experience of life. We live the idea of love rather than the felt experience of love. We ponder religion rather than experience God, and how this is prevalent in all of us. But understanding these holy ideas can help us to shift out of it, and then finally move into the virtue that is characteristic of type 5, which is the virtue of non-attachment. And we'll explore what that means from an Enneagram perspective. But first, let's talk about walls. So I invite you to consider, the ways in which from the moment you get up, what kind of walls do you experience between yourself and others? As an Enneagram type 1, you've heard that one way in which I build walls is through judgment. Like I prejudge people. There's a way in which, by having a judgment, I can already distance myself from someone, reject them before they can reject me. Have you ever walked into a room and you find yourself standing like this? That there's a wall that you build just in, like, who are you, right? And can you impact or affect me? So we do it physically. We do it through our thinking mind. And we often, if we have been hurt, and I would say most of us have been hurt at some point in our lives within our families, that we build walls around our hearts to protect ourselves from further hurt. Walls in which we don't necessarily want to reach out and love everyone equally, although we talk about oneness. But we're going to love and disseminate love rather selectively, right? And just the fact that we do that tells us that we have walls. We've decisions around who's worthy of us opening up and who is not. As I pondered the topic of walls, I came across this cute little question about what happens when a fish runs into a wall. What happened when the fish ran into the wall? It said, "Damn." And what happened when two walls talked to each other? What did they say? "I'll meet you at the corner." And I share these not merely to just share jokes, but there's something telling even within this description, and I'll bring it back a little bit later. There's this idea that we have walls, and what I want to invite us into considering is that none of them are real. That walls do not exist. We may think they exist. We may construct them in our own consciousness. But in truth, walls meet. People meet. That there's a corner and there's a place where everyone and everything intersects. And it's actually coming into a deeper realization of that truth. That everything hits. The way the Enneagram teachings say it is that everything interpenetrates. And that if we are honest, if we steep ourselves in this deeper truth, then we start to live from a different kind of reality where we are less defended within a fortress of our own concepts, and we begin to invite the world in, not really in because there's no in then and no out. We begin to recognize the interpenetration, the interwovenness, and the interconnectedness of us in every moment. We understand what psychologists say when we build healthy boundaries in relationships. People think healthy boundaries is often like building a wall right against someone. But we only build walls, let's say we've been in a codependent relationship. We will build walls of like definitive yes, no, I will never, and I would do this. Why? When we actually can't manage the interaction of the space, the fluidity of the space. So sometimes building walls is an important step. But the next step in the healthiness of relationship can be where we can actually be more movable. That every moment has a choice point. It's not a never or always with people. That there is a movability and a permeability to the natural way the world works. Because if the truth of nature is that, then we are actually going to be more skilled practitioners of life when we live with this deep comprehension and deep awareness that walls are actually only constructed in our own heads. And so that's a beginning of recognizing that maybe I can become even more fluid than I have been, whether or not I'm a 5. And if you are a 5, I want to begin, or if you're in relationship with a 5, I want to begin by sharing the personality construct of the 5. So the idea of this type is that having lost sight of the holy ideas of holy omniscience and holy transparency, which I'll explain in a second, and having lost sight of the virtue of non-attachment, the 5 develops an egoic structure around a mental fixation on what is known as ego stinginess, a kind of hoarding of self. Now, this isn't necessarily a physical hoarding of things, but mostly it is this idea of what it looked like for me over here, inside my little house here, protected behind my walls, collecting what little I think I have and amassing it and keeping it. So ego stinginess is the mental fixation of the type 5, and the corollary to that on the emotional or heart level is avarice. Avarice, another word for greed. Again, not necessarily greed for money. Often, in fact, greed for knowledge, for ideas, as a compensatory method for a personality structure that has lost sight of its fundamental knowing. So going back to Rain Man, there's a quote, passage in there that I want to share with you. We talk about emotions and our capacity to experience life. Some of us are so shut down that we don't comprehend a world that has an emotive quality about it, right? And Rain Man is a caricature of that way of being in the world. So when Charlie first meets him and says, "Listen, Ray, our dad died," that means he's not with us anymore. Did they tell you about that? Raymond replies, "I don't know." Charlie asks, "You don't know if they told you, or you don't know what death is?" Raymond replied, "I don't know." I don't know is in a way the mantra of the type 5. Having lost sight of the holy idea of holy omniscience, and of course the word omniscience comes from the Latin omni, and essentially the word that is the derivation of the word science. Omni is all, and science is like knowledge, so all-knowing. The type 5 has lost sight of this fundamental perception of the knowingness of the nature of reality. I don't know, says the 5. And those of us on a spiritual path have heard this idea that spiritual progress or awakening is about enlightenment. You know, and enlightenment and awakening, even those words relate to knowing. So there's a knowingness about the nature of the universe. There's a knowingness about the fundamental beingness of life. The 5, having lost sight of this, believes that it better go frickin' figure it out. And so the endless quest for knowledge through books is driven by this fundamental lack that it perceives it has, that it can actually only find at the depths of its own being, but is perpetually propelled outside itself to find. But what it lacks in this knowing isn't just the intellectual knowing that we normally equate with knowing. Holy omniscience relates to that part in every single one of us that knows that not only is there a unity to all of life, like a oneness, like one ocean, but there is a oneness within the differentiated parts of life. So this is a funky nuance because we often talk about unity and oneness in the same breath as if it's the same thing. So I want to make a distinction here to say that in this framework, unity can be seen as looking at the ocean and saying that's one ocean. Oneness is looking at each and every wave and saying that wave is one with the ocean. Looking at the differentiated parts of the ocean and saying, I am one with that ocean. The type 5 has lost sight of this face of reality that says, I am actually one with that ocean. So if I don't know that, what happens to me? I believe I'm a wave separate from the ocean. Now, if you can imagine what it would be like if you don't have the sweep of the entire ocean lifting you up as a wave, how are you going to feel? Unsupported fundamentally. Unsupported, alone, isolated, and also weak, because there's nothing in you to move you. There is no foundation from the ocean itself. You're separate in that particular way, or so you believe, that you are not one with the ocean, but a separate wave. And boy, if you're separate and you're little and the ocean's big, there is then this feeling of isolation, this feeling that you need to protect yourself and keep what little you already have. But within that, what happens is, if we go back to that analogy of a prison wall, not only do you build a prison wall around you, you don't call it a prison, you call it home. It's the most comfortable place in the world. It's actually your own mind. And because you actually won't go outside because it's scary and it feels like you're separating yourself even more from source, you feel like you don't have the resources. The world outside is tumultuous and demanding, and you don't have the resources to go outside and figure that out. So you're going to stay in here. But if the staying in here keeps you small and limited, then what happens is not only do you have a wall, you start to put pictures up and decorate this home of yours, right? And so the type 5 does this through books, through ideas, through learning. Because we all long for the closest thing we can find to experiencing life. And if you're not willing to walk out and encounter life, then the best thing you can do is read about it. The best thing you can do is find as many photos of it as possible, and you put it on this wall. And some of these photos might be photos of you. So the idea then is, what you do is you look at these photos and you have something like an experience of life, and you read a lot of these books in hopes that maybe one day you'll feel like you know enough, you'll be resourced enough to then venture out into the world and be fed. Now, even though I'm not a type 5, when I read about this idea of feeling like the world demands too much and gives too little, that I realized that for me, that's actually a repeated pattern of my own life. That I could feel into the compassion for a type that perhaps initially I felt was, wow, you're so withdrawn. Why are you over there? And I'm like, I look to the moments in my life when I feel like the burdens of everyone's demands on me are so great. And that I'm not fed by anyone, but instead I'm only doing the feeding. And when I can tap into that, then I understand both the pain and the suffering of the 5, but I also realize the path 5. Because it's the same path out for me when I'm in that place. When I'm in that place when the world seems to demand too much, as a minister, I realize it's because I have not allowed for intimacy in our relating. Because if I am only over here helping with my good advice, dispensing support in this way, but not in a way where I'm impacted by you, then the very way in which I can be nourished by my relationships, the very way in which I can be nourished by the interaction in life gets taken away from me. And so I understand that in my giving to the world, if I am not giving of my entire self, if I am not there in heart and soul, in body, that it becomes a cyclical pattern of exhaustion, right? And there lies the quandary of the 5. This repeated pattern of exhaustion because I'm trying to relate to the world from inside here, a place where I will never get fed by anyone or anything because I am not letting myself be touched or impacted by any of you. And to recognize that it's actually the vulnerability of stepping out into relationship in a way where I understand that you can do something, and if I really let myself feel, I can maybe feel hurt by what you did. But not only can I feel hurt by what you did, I can also feel grateful for what you did. I could also feel loved by what you did. But I can't when I'm over there, because over there I'm only reading picture books and I'm shouting out my good advice over the wall. And so we can recognize that there might be ways in which, whether we are 5s or not on the Enneagram, that we carve out a piece of ourselves that stays behind a wall. And in that, we create a cycle of not getting fed by the very thing that we're feeding, by the very dynamic that we're seeking to have in our lives. And we're only tossing out toward it, but never entering it in a way where it changes us, it impacts us. It moves us, it transforms us, it hurts us, it awakens us. So the invitation to all of us, but especially to the 5s, because while all of us build walls, 5s make a profession out of this thing, you know? They make it an identity to such a degree that many of you who might be 5s will sit behind this and start to become, a term often used for 5s is resigned. You sit inside this wall for so long that you start to disown any of your needs at all. Your needs for companionship and love, your need for zest and zeal and aliveness. And you sit behind this and become resigned to, my life is the reading of this picture book, where scenes pass by, but I remain an observer, unaffected by those things. And I can analyze those things, and the more I analyze them, the more I stay apart, because the mind and its mental constructs actually create false divisions between you and me, and I don't get to experience you if I'm actually reflecting on my idea of you. And so the invitation, again, to 5s and to all of us is to become aware of how there feels like a depletion in a certain area of life, perhaps, maybe all areas. That the depletion isn't because the world demands too much. Rather, the depletion is because I have not entered the world in order to receive from it. That I am not available to the world to have myself impacted by it. And I can start to do that by entering in with my heart. As a type 5, which is a head type, or when we go to 5, we go into our head type and our head space. There is such an importance to the heart's intelligence, the heart's movement, that doesn't say, oh, Yes, I love and therefore this wall is coming down. But there's something else about steeping into your awareness of how your heart sees. And if you can sink into that and comprehend that maybe the world is actually impermeable, that I don't need to guard myself, that in fact the doing so is the reaffirming of something that is not true about reality. And fives who like to be competent and skillful should know that competency and skillfulness arise naturally from recognizing reality as it truly is. Recognizing that we are intimately bound with one another. That we can't help but relate and impact one another. And until we get out of the illusion that we can actually be an island unto ourselves, until we're actually willing to release that illusion that's actually, I don't know if you could play it, Bob, but that's embodied by the song. This famous song by Simon and Garfunkel, I Am a Rock. Listen to the words. This is like the fives mantra. I am a rock. A winter's day in a deep and dark December. I am alone, gazing from my window to the streets below on a freshly fallen, silent shroud of snow. I am a rock. I am an island. I've built walls, a fortress deep and mighty that none may penetrate. I have no need of friendship. Friendship causes pain. It's laughter and it's loving I disdain. I am a rock. I am an island. Don't talk of love, but I've heard the words before. It's sleeping in my memory. I won't disturb the slumber of feelings that have died. If I never loved, I never would have cried. I am a rock. I'm an island. I have my books and my poetry to protect me. I am shielded in my armor, hiding in my room, safe within my womb. I touch no one, and no one touches me. I am a rock. I am an island. And a rock feels no pain. And an island never cries. And this is the lie and delusion of the type 5. And so long as we or it remains in this delusion, we suffer and we struggle in isolation from one another, not impacted by the world. But the invitation into the holy ideas of holy omniscience, and I'll tie in holy transparency in a second, is to recognize that we are not only that inner coming into of the knowing of life, we are not only coming into a knowing of our interdependency and interconnectedness with one another, but there's a deeper, more profound calling to that knowing. Because in the knowing of yourself as one with Spirit or with God, we come to understand, whether you're type 1 or any type, that the knowing of self is the way that God knows itself through us. Because if you take a step back and go, in ultimate oneness, nothing can be known. In the absolute, nothing can be experienced. But I and you, each of you uniquely in your differentiated self, become the hands and the feet of the divine, but only if you're willing. The divine isn't looking for picture books to experience life, but life gets lived and known through each of us living out fully our lives, our individual lives, the life that only can be lived at the point of each of you, only felt, only relished at the uniqueness that is who you are. So the invitation to the knowing of holy omniscience is in this next quote, and that's artwork by John, by the way, amazing artwork. Yay. To know the truth of holy omniscience is to know that you are the eyes of the universe. And so to experience that in a whole way, we would probably add the hands and the feet, the arms and the embrace. We are the tears of the universe and the laughter of the universe. But so long as we don't let ourselves live in that fluidity that results in messiness, like tears and pain and loss and lack, then we don't get to live out sort of our place in the scheme of things, our place in the universe. And so the next quote by Almas, your job is to make that eye completely transparent. That's holy transparency, and completely open so that you can give the universe an experience of itself in all its dimensionality, in all its variety, in all its colors and flavors. Through us, the universe comes to know itself. And whenever we say no to experience, difficult experience as well as positive experience, whichever it is we tend to wall ourselves from, we are actually inhibiting the universe knowing itself in this profound way that happens only within each of us. But again, the lack of that knowing is the deep delusion of the five. And the reason why there is this need, it believes, to hoard and gather information, to figure it out, to collect it and put it on the walls of your experience. Because it's as if this mural that I put around me in my mind can replace my felt reality or experience. But when I know that, when I fall out of the delusion that that is actually reality and that that actually is enough, then I begin my journey back into the messy juiciness of life and living and emotionality and of too many tears, right? Of brokenness and coming back together again, of life, of living. And it is in this way that the fives naturally, as the five, as all of us embody the holy ideas of holy omniscience and holy transparency, we move back into the heart place, the virtue of non-attachment. And I want to make sure our definition of non-attachment is clear here. From Sandra Maitre's Enneagram of the Passions and Virtues, the virtue of non-attachment implies no longer clinging to our sense of self and connotes taking in exactly what we need and letting everything else go. And so naturally, when we believe in the fluidity of the universe, we don't think we need to hoard in our little chamber over here. We allow things to come and to go. We trust in that movement of all things. And in that trust, we begin to let ourselves live more fully. And I'll close with a poem One of my favorites by Donna Markova. Some of you who know me well have heard this many a time. Again, John's artwork, the phoenix. So we can use the phoenix analogy to consider that the fear of getting burned that the 5 tries to avoid in the shelter of its own thoughts and ideas protected from other people, that walking into and through that fear is actually what transforms the 5, allows it to live its most radiant life as symbolized by the phoenix analogy. And so this poem, and I may not have it like verbatim here, but it's one of my favorites. And it goes like this. And I invite you to even close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing so, to take it in. And especially, this is for everyone, but especially you 5s. I will not die an unlived life. I will not live in fear of falling or catching fire. I choose to inhabit my days, to allow my living to open me, to allow my heart to open to become a wing, a torch, a promise. I choose to risk my significance, so that which came to me as seed goes forth as blossom, and that which came to me as blossom goes on as fruit. I will not die an unlived life.